Hello. I would like to tell you some stories today. Back in 1967, a new TV show, Dragnet, used this opening. The story you are about to see is true. The names have been changed to protect the innocent. And my stories are also true, and I do not name any names either. So let's get started. This story is about taking the wrong medicine on 2 different occasions while working a graveyard shift. After my mission, I started applying for work, preferably in law enforcement, while going to college. I applied and tested in a couple of nearby cities. I was offered a graveyard dispatching position by a chief of police in a town near where I lived. This was in the early months of 1970. The dispatching offer was a civilian position, but I planned on becoming a peace officer for my career. The chief of police had promised that he would get a new patrol position, which I would have, in the upcoming July city budget meeting for the new fiscal year. I was engaged to a wonderful girl and attending classes at a university. Graveyard seemed like a good choice, although I had never worked them before. One night, I was struggling to stay awake. I was also fighting a minor head cold and a runny nose. I saw a bottle of Allerest. It was in an officer's mail slot. It was a popular cold and flu medication back in the 70s. I knew the officer and knew he would be okay if I borrowed some Allerest and paid him for it later. I took 2. I have a tendency to take the maximum adult dose for aspirin and other similar stuff because I'm somewhat resistant to those kind of medications. After a time, I began to feel worse, dizzy and lightheaded, and a little disoriented. I told the shift leader I was sick and I had to go home. At home, things continued to get worse, and I began to think I was having a drug reaction. At one point, I found everything funny. I recall sneaking downstairs and peeking around the corner and giggling at my mother. Then I went through a phase where I was delirious, and after that I began having convulsions and stomach cramps. As things got worse, I began asking for my fiancée, and my mother asked her to come. She was with me during the rest of the ordeal. Over time, I became more clear-minded, but the convulsions continued and were very painful. My mother called a doctor. He told her that it was probably something I ate, and that if I hadn't died already, I probably wouldn't. Eventually, the convulsions stopped and I went to sleep. The next day, the chief of police came to see me. He told us that the Allerest I had taken was confiscated from a drug offender and was suspected of having a drop of LSD on each capsule. The officer hadn't taken the time at the end of his shift to book it into evidence. He had just left it in a slot. A lab test later confirmed that I had taken a double dose of LSD. The chief asked me to sign a paper agreeing not to sue the city, and I signed it. At the time, I was just grateful to be alive. When I was hired, I made it clear that I wanted to advance to a patrolman position and go to the police academy. The chief had agreed to help me and said the city council had promised him that new patrol position. So with that assurance, I got married on July the 2nd and went on our honeymoon. I expected to come home to start my new patrol position and go to the police academy. Instead, I came home and found out I was laid off. The chief said the city council did not give him the new position, and they had, in fact, even eliminated my dispatching position. So I was newly married and out of work. But I'm sure the chief and the city council were worried about their liability I represented and decided to get rid of it. I think it was a dirty deal, but it led to a better job. I had already applied and tested for another larger city police department position. About 2 weeks after being laid off, I got a letter from the larger city telling me I had passed all of their tests to be hired and only had to have a polygraph test before starting. We moved, and I went to work as a patrolman. But graveyard shifts in that city were still hard, and I guess I still had another lesson to learn the hard way. One night I was having a really hard time staying awake as the shift continued. I tried eating, walking around, singing, and other stuff without success. Finally, I stopped at an all-night convenience store and bought some NoDoz tablets. Every time I got tired, I took another tablet. And by the time the end of the night was over, I realized I'd taken every one of the tablets out of that bottle over the course of the night. That's an overdose for sure, but it seemed to work. I made it through the night and went home to get some sleep. Then I started throwing up blood and passing blood into the toilet. It was all fresh, red-colored blood. We didn't have a doctor in our new city yet, so we called my parents and were told to call my mom's doctor. He told me to go immediately to the hospital. They found a hole in my stomach and put 4 quarts of blood back into me. I had lost consciousness by that time and wasn't aware of it. We learned that NoDoz was basically caffeine. It says so right on the bottle. I just didn't know what caffeine did to you. And I had overdosed on it, causing a bleeding ulcer. The doctor told me I could have died if we had waited any longer to get to the hospital. I still had to work graveyard shifts, but I eventually moved to a higher position as an evidence technician. And that was a day shift job, so nighttime call-outs were rare. Years later, I had to start working graveyards again at a Wyoming open-pit coal mine. It was hard to stay awake there too, but no more medicine help was even considered. I quit after 3 years in the coal mine and took another job, even though the mine was the highest paid work I have ever had. A small part of the reason was because of those graveyard shifts. I just can't stay awake to work them. But there is a bright side as well. I almost always fall asleep at bedtime in less than 5 minutes, and I sleep deeply, and it is easy for me to get up early. Well, that is all for this video. Thank you for your time.